All right, hello and welcome to our first lecture on thought, religion, and culture. Today we are going to start from the early period and we are going to look at shamanism and Buddhism, actually animism, shamanism, and Buddhism from the early period. So one of the things that I would like you to keep in mind as we go through the last few weeks of the semester looking at these, great bodies of thought, is to try to think of culture and thought or ideology as something that is constantly evolving and changing. Now, if I were to ask you, how do you define culture? I know that you all, instinctively know what culture is, but, is culture is a combination of many different things. It can be language, it can be religion, it can be food, it can be clothing, it can be many different things, and it's this combination. But because over time culture changes, and culture has this tendency to take on different things, and as it takes it on, or as it moves from one area, one location to another location, and then it adapts to the local environment, it tends to change and evolve. And this being a history class, we want to look at how do these major trends, how do they change? How do they adapt to the local environment? Why do some things become extremely popular and accepted and adapt, whereas other things do not? And why is it that a certain body of thought might be very popular and flourish in one time period, but then it does not in another time period? So, as historians, these are the kinds of questions that we ask, and these are the kinds of overall trends that we're looking at. And so these are some of the things that I'd like you to keep in mind. To give you just an example of how this works, and to simplify this for you, if we think of something like, let's say, Japanese culture. How do we know that this is Japanese, right? So whenever I ask my students in class and I ask them, okay, so what country is this from? It is immediately identifiable as Japanese. Why is that? Well, because of the style of dress, because of the textiles that are used, because of the certain type of makeup and hairstyle. So this has become emblematic of Japanese culture. But this doesn't mean that this just stays frozen in time, or that it just moves from century to century as is without ever changing, because in fact it does change over time, and we do see how Japanese culture adapts, and it changes, and it takes on other characteristics and other traits. So we look at something like this, and it's still identifiably Japanese. We can tell immediately that it's Japanese, although it has more of a modern take to it. And so this is what I mean by trying to think of thought or culture or ideology as something that is constantly evolving and changing. So rather than treating it as a fossil that remains the same and stagnant over time, I would like you to think of culture and thought as something that is actually like a living organism and that adapts to its local context and local environment and then evolves. So as we look at this, this is again very identifiably Japanese. This is a temple in Kyoto. So this is again symbolizing very traditional style Japanese architecture, but this is also Japanese architecture. And even though they're very different, still it's all a part of what we label as Japanese culture. Same with this, right? You can walk into any Japanese restaurant and you will always see this cat, the cat of good fortune. And so this is also very immediately identifiable as Japanese, but so is this. So all of these are a part of Japanese culture, just like when we look at Korea. So this is a very famous painting from the Joseon dynasty, and we can tell immediately that this is a Joseon Yangban by his clothing and the horsehair hat. But this is also Korean culture. And with the advent and popularity of K-pop, most people will look at this individual and immediately know, oh yeah, this is Korean. Just as this is also very a famous painting, again from the Joseon dynasty, but this is also very Korean. So it all falls under the umbrella of Korean culture. All right, so the earliest forms of belief were related to animism. And animism is this belief that everything has some kind of a spirit or special energy. So it can be all kinds of animals or inanimate objects too. So we see here, this is a pear. It's basically like tree trunks that are protecting the village. Here we have a mountain god. But animism, it's this idea that these non-human entities, they have this kind of spirit, some kind of energy, or some kind of even personality or particular characteristic. And these can include rivers, mountains, trees, rocks, tigers, etc. Because in Korea is like 80% mountainous territory, there are a lot of mountain gods. There also used to be a lot of tigers on the Korean peninsula, and so we see them represented in as divine entities. Now, this is different from shamanism. So in shamanism, there's the idea that there are certain human beings that possess a special gift or talent, and that they can communicate between the spiritual world and the physical world. So they are like an intermediary between the spiritual world and the physical world. So this is different from animism. Shamans, they interact with non-human spirits, such as disease-causing spirits or a god that lives in the home, and they interact with them and try to harness as much good energy or fortune as possible. All right, so and shamanism is we see shamans and evidence of shamans historically prevalent throughout Asia. So we see this, particularly Northeast Asia. We see a lot of evidence of this. Now, there are different types of shamans. So there are those who become possessed by spirits. the gift of being able to communicate between the spiritual and the physical world is often believed to be inherited. So it's not something that you can learn, or it's not a skill that you can acquire, but it is something that you are born with, and usually it has been passed down from your parent or a relative. There are some who go into a trance, but they are not possessed, and they may be able to predict the future. In Korea, the vast majority of shamans have always been women. And shamans should not be confused with fortune tellers. So when you go to Hongdae and you go to get your fortune read, those are not shamans. Now, these shamans, they perform different kinds of rituals. These are called gut in Korean. So there's an initiation ritual. There's a ritual to honor the shaman's guardian deity. So usually each shaman is associated with some kind of a deity. There's a ritual for the dead, either to send your recently deceased one off to the spiritual world, or if they are already in the spiritual world, then to interact with them. There's a ritual for good luck, so either good health or wealth, or for the birth of a son. There's a ritual for a new beginning, so if you move into a new home or you start a new business. There are rituals for healing, so if you are sick, there's a ritual for healing. Rituals for rain, so as we've discussed in previous lectures, when the economy is primarily agrarian and is dependent on Mother Nature and the weather, then it's not surprising that you would have rituals for rain, rituals for telling the future, and also rituals for household gods. Now, interestingly enough, there are still many shamans in Korea, and these shamans still perform rituals. So you can still you can seek out a shaman's services, and you can ask them to perform any one of these different rituals. When I first moved to Korea, I lived in an apartment and then ended up moving out of that apartment 2 years later. And it was because the owner was selling the apartment, and so somebody else bought it. And when the new owner came to look at the apartment and was going to buy it, she decided that she needed to bring in a shaman. And the shaman came in and looked at the layout of the apartment, and I believe, I didn't see it, but I believe conducted a ritual for prosperity of this new home, and had the owner change the layout of, how far the kitchen was to extend, and the bathroom and whatnot. So these are still rituals that are performed. There are any number of mothers that will go to shamans before the National College entrance exams, and they will pray for their children to do well on the exams and get into the university of their choice. So this is still quite prevalent. We still see that shamans play a role in modern day Korean society. All right, so if we look at the early beliefs, the shamans would interact with the deities of nature, the gods of nature. Again, this is because it was an agrarian society and dependent on the weather. There are tutelary deities. There are dead humans who have become gods or spirits. There are gods dealing with birth and death. There are gods dealing with disease. And then later on, as Buddhism and Taoism becomes introduced to Korea, Buddhist deities and Taoist deities are incorporated into shamanistic beliefs. So there are many different deities. Now, among all of these different deities or these gods, unlike a belief system like Christianity, there is no supreme being. So there isn't a supreme God who is almighty, omniscient, omnipresent. It doesn't work that way. And there is no hierarchy of gods. So whereas in other belief systems like Buddhism, or if we look at the Greek gods, there's a hierarchy, and we see that there's a differentiation amongst the gods. But in these early belief systems, there is no hierarchy. And these gods usually do not serve as models of moral behavior. They are actually quite human. They exhibit very human characteristics. And each of them have very specific powers and responsibilities. So rather than an all-powerful God like a Christian God, these individual gods or deities, they have a very specific power. And the interaction with these gods, it's more like bargaining rather than worshiping. So the role of the shaman is, let's say, if there is someone who is ill, who is sick in your household, and so the shaman comes in and is going to perform a healing ritual. Well, it needs to appeal to these gods in order to either expel the disease or to bring in the healing god to help this person get better. And in order to do that, the shamans, they will flatter the gods, they will bribe the gods. They'll say, oh, if you heal this person, then this person will do this and this and this for you. It's actually not that, because having grown up in a Christian background, it's really not that different from the way that Christians often will structure their prayers, or it's like, oh God, please, if you help my family out of this difficult time, then I will dedicate my life to helping the poor. And that's a form of negotiation or a form of bargaining. And so this is something that the shaman does, that the role the shaman plays is to act out this negotiation or this bargaining. All right, so then once Buddhism becomes introduced, as it is introduced during the Three Kingdoms period, we begin to see the slow incorporation of Buddhist aspects into these early shamanistic beliefs. So, for example, we have the 7 stars, which is a shamanistic belief. They're called Chilsung. If you've heard of Chilsung Saida, that's kind of association to that. But then these 7 stars, these gods become incorporated into also the Buddhist deities, and we see the 7 stars, which originally have shamanistic origins. We see them incorporated into Buddhist temples, paintings of them in Buddhist temples. This is a modern day rendition of the Chisung, the 7 stars. All right. So this kind of an early belief is the animism and the shamanism, this is also seen in many other cultures. So, for example, you can see this in Japanese Shinto. So, this was a very popular belief system in Japan that also incorporated Buddhist and Taoist elements. Until the late medieval period, Shinto and Buddhism were pretty much synonymous with each other, and it gradually goes on to acquire a modern meaning as it is reformed, and it includes emperor worship, and this is something that is used to instill a sense of nationalism and pride of the country. But Shinto really does believe that every is very animistic in the sense that it believes that these non-human entities, they have some kind of special spirit or energy and must be given the appropriate respect and honor. And this is still widely practiced in modern day Japan. Now, the thing with animism, shamanism, or something like Shinto that you'll want to keep in mind is that these beliefs are very, very localized. So the shaman in one village will have certain characteristics and personality, and if the village is in or near a mountain, then will usually be associated with a mountain god. But then if you're in another village that is on the coast and by the sea, then the gods that they appeal to tend to be different kinds of gods, like the gods of the sea. So when their fishermen go out for the day to catch their fish, then the shaman will perform a ritual for their safety and for safe waters and a good harvest. So it's very, very local. And the identity and the characteristic and the beliefs are influenced and shaped by that local context. It's the same with Shinto that we see in Japan. We also see evidence of shamanism on the Chinese mainland. So some of the earliest dynasties on record were based on ideas of ancestor worship as well as belief in nature gods. So again, there is this animistic belief, and they did have these shamans that acted as intermediaries. And one of their roles was divination. So what they would do was they would heat a tortoise shell, like so, until it cracked. And then they would interpret the cracks in order to make their predictions, and then they would write it on there. This is a Chinese Wu master, more of a modern day shaman. So we see that this one is a man. You saw that the Shinto priest in Japan is a man, but in Korea, shamans tended to be, or usually were, women. All right, so this brings us to Buddhism. Because Buddhism was introduced so early on into Korea, and then began to adapt to the local context and became fused with local beliefs there, it's important for us to understand sort of just the basics of Buddhism. So Buddha, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha, was a person who had lived in the 500s to 400s BC, and he inherited an ancient Hindu worldview, right? So it's not like Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy just poof came out of nowhere and he thought of it. No, he had already been influenced by a belief system that had been in place for many, many years. But as a noble, he was a prince, he was dissatisfied, and so went off to contemplate on the meaning of life, and then came up with his own formulation. But it's still influenced by what existed at the time. So one example of this is of the idea of rebirth, right? So this idea is that you live multiple lives. So if you live, you die, you're reborn, and then you live, you die, and you're reborn. So there's this idea of rebirth. The other is the idea of karma. So what you do in this life will affect what your rebirth will be in the next life. So if you're good in this life, then you will be reborn into a better life in the next life. But if you are bad in this life, then you will be reborn into a lower or less desirable position in the next life. And the third aspect is this idea of that there is this eternal self. So there's like this essence of you and what makes you you. And it is this essence that keeps getting reborn through this cycle of rebirth. And it may take on different forms dependent on karma, but it's still that essence is you. All right, so these are some of the things that he was influenced by, but he came up with what is called the Four Noble Truths. So for him, one of his points of enlightenment was that all life is suffering, right? This life, the previous life, the next life, all life is suffering. And the root of the suffering is our attachment to life or to our sense of self, this Atman, and whether or not we're going to be reborn into a better life. So this is the root of suffering. But the third truth that he came up with is that this suffering can end. It is possible to end the suffering, and there is a path to end the suffering, which of course is his philosophy of Buddhism. So in order for us to overcome the suffering, first you have to understand that life is suffering, and then you have to let go. So let go of it. Let go of all of the attachments that we have to our life. This includes, food and clothing, money and family. Just we need to let go. And then we also have to realize that it is possible to end the suffering. And then once we do this, then cultivate the path towards enlightenment or trying to reach nirvana. So this is really just the very, very fundamental principles of Buddhism. To get a little bit more philosophical and abstract, so yourself, the Atman, has a body, has emotions and ideas and a consciousness. But he says, the Buddha says that actually there is no self. It's just an assemblage of all of these different things, and in rebirth, when you are born into a different life, some parts are removed, some parts are rearranged in a different way. So you are yourself, but you're not yourself at the same time. All right, so Buddhism, it has its origins in India, and then it travels in different directions. It traveled via this way through the Silk Road to China, and then to Korea, and then to Japan. And so there are two main types of Buddhism. There's Mahayana Buddhism, which made its way to Korea and Japan, and there's Theravada Buddhism, which made its way to Southeast Asia. Mahayana Buddhism is considered to be the greater vehicle, where the object is about trying to achieve enlightenment for the most number of people possible. Theravada Buddhism is the lesser vehicle, and it's about individual enlightenment and salvation. All right, so we saw that Buddhism was traveling, or the ideas, and with the ideas, texts and monks and students and different things like that, traveling along the Silk Road, and it makes its way to China. And it becomes particularly popular as the Han Dynasty declines, and it falls into ruin, and there's a period of disunity. So Chinese elites begin to turn away from Confucianism and then turn to Taoism and Buddhism. So that by the Tang Dynasty, remember this was the height of the Silk Road, Buddhism reaches its zenith in its popularity, and this is really considered to be like the golden age of Buddhism in China. And from China, Buddhism spreads to the rest of East Asia. Now, when Buddhism came from India into China, it came, and by that time, there were many, many, many different schools of Buddhism in India. Just like there are many, many different schools of Christianity, there are many different schools of Buddhism. And so these had developed into different schools in India, and they are coming into China. And so what the Chinese did, first of all, they had to translate the texts from Sanskrit to classical Chinese. And then they organized all of these scriptures and they systematized them into a Buddhist canon. Now, each one of these different schools of Buddhism, they emphasize certain scriptures, and this is exactly what we see in Christianity today, that different schools of Christianity, whether it's like the Methodists or the Presbyterians or the Baptists or whoever, they emphasize different scriptures. But the Chinese, they put them all together into a one Buddhist canon. They were not sectarian like the Indians were. Of course, each school made their own claims to the highest truth, but they were not exclusive. They were not like, well, what we believe is the only truth and everything else is false. So it develops into the 6th century, the golden age of Buddhism being during the Tang Dynasty, and we see developing 3 main different types of Buddhism in China. There's scholastic Buddhism, devotional Buddhism, and meditational Buddhism. Scholastic Buddhism is the belief that one can gain enlightenment, you can attain enlightenment through study of the scriptures. Devotional Buddhism is the belief that you can attain enlightenment just through faith. And meditational Buddhism is the belief that you can attain enlightenment through meditation. Now, why would these different types develop? Well, we have to look at the Chinese context, right? When you have a large and powerful scholarly class or governmental bureaucratic class that is highly educated, then scholastic Buddhism is going to be very appealing to them. If you are a farmer and you are illiterate, you do not have time to or the resources to get an education, then devotional Buddhism will be very appealing to you. Or let's say you are a military officer and you are involved in protecting the country and defending the dynasty. You don't really have time to sit down and study the scriptures. Meditational Buddhism is very appealing. So these different types of Buddhism develop and they become almost tailor-made to the different classes and the different populations within China. All right, so this will bring us to the end of part 1 of our look at animism, shamanism, and Buddhism. And stay tuned for part 2.